Good morning, everyone. It's a bit of a day of firsts today. So today is my first day back in London for 16 months. It's my first time speaking in public for 16 months. And it's my first day on a train for 16 months. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to get out of your pyjamas and your sweatpants and your slippers and put something on your bottom half that everyone doesn't have to see. And it's nice to see how tall you all are. Because for the last 16 months, we've all been guessing, right? We just see this bit. I'm here today to talk to you about retail, to be fair. I kind of find it really interesting when I get classed as an industry expert. I've been working in the payments field for 4 years. I've always been in retail before that. I won't give away how many years, but I've always been in retail before that. So everything that we talk about retail. We don't talk about anything else. And for those of you who don't know who Adyen are, so the first thing to point out is it is spelt correctly. Generally, when we give somebody a slide deck, they correct it on our behalf to Aiden. So it is spelt correctly. And generally, the question we get asked is, who are you? And we always think about it in terms of when we go to the New York office and they say to us, who are you? At Homeland Security, and we say what we do, and they go, oh, right, same as PayPal. And we kind of think about that and go, yes, because it's much easier than standing there for 3/4 of an hour explaining why you're not PayPal. But we're definitely not PayPal. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you, as the title suggests, just about a couple of things. So I'm going to share with you what we have seen during the last 18 months in terms of retail and retail response to COVID. And I'm not going to focus too heavily on payments. I think what we're going to do is look at the wider subject of flexibility, and we're going to look at how retailers have responded to the pandemic, which is a subject a lot of people talk about right now. It's quite interesting for us to do it through the eyes of a service provider providing payment technology. So hopefully, there we go. So first thing to point out, before I joined Adyen, I was the retail director of Burberry, which is why I'm allowed to use a slide which includes Burberry. Generally, they're very protective, but I kind of have a little bit of a right to talk about Burberry because I was there for 10 years. Burberry's an interesting business because it was very much a forerunner for the introduction of a digital strategy into its retail division. And it was adopting a digital strategy way before other luxury retailers. And there's a few interesting kind of landmarks we can think about with Burberry in terms of how it embraced digital technology. So the first thing, for those of you who don't know, it was the first luxury retailer to sell directly from the runway. So customers could actually buy directly from the runway and have it in their wardrobe 8 weeks later. And that went to press. That was a fantastic result. We didn't talk a great deal about the fact that in all of the corporate head offices, everyone had to switch off the laptops. We couldn't do any work while it was happening because we just couldn't affect the bandwidth. But it was the first forerunner to be able to buy direct from runway. It also coined the phrase retail theatre. And they adopted retail theatre in their stores with the idea that they wanted to step away from being a retail store to being a showroom. And if any of you ever visit any of the big London flagship stores, one of the things you'll see is how they harness RFID technology. And what they do is you have things like bags sitting on podiums. And when you put a bag on a podium, all of the screens around the building will tell you about the bag, which is quite innovative. And then the other thing that was really interesting about Burberry is they recognized very early that e-commerce was its biggest window. It was its biggest window. And when we think about windows, we always think about flagship stores and windows. And what they realized very early was that they had a window to the world through their e-commerce site. And that concept of having a window to the world then drove a strategy which said, we must be consistent. We now need to start to think about one strategy across all customer touch points. And that principle of one window underpinned everything that they did. But the interesting point for us is always that retail's been evolving. It has been evolving, and we've all seen it. Now, some of you may have seen this principle of what McKinsey calls the quickening. But the broad concept is very simple. What we saw in 90 days was 10 years of technology advancement, which gave people whiplash because the retail sector, the consumer sector, accelerated very, very quickly, and it had to as a direct response to COVID. And what we saw during that time is some businesses pivoted and responded very well, and others weren't able to do so. And the point throughout this for us is that COVID didn't drive change. That change was already there. It just increased the momentum for it. So what underpins that? Well, the first thing is that logically, when retail stores closed, people still had a desire to shop, and they had to move that shopping online. And one of the things that we see, especially when we look at traffic coming across the platform, is that as retail reopens, e-commerce traffic doesn't drop. Because one of the things that COVID taught people was that actually it was really easy to do. In fact, it was so easy to do that there wasn't always a necessity to go back to bricks and mortar. It by no means suggests that bricks and mortar is dead, but what it does say is that there was a wide adoption during COVID of e-commerce purchase, and that has remained. That was really important for retailers because now, with a higher adoption rate of e-commerce, they were able to touch more customers, and it created a very competitive environment. And having worked in retail for quite a number of years, one of the things that I think is really important for us as a payment provider to acknowledge is that we're a tiny cog. We are just a tiny cog in a machine, right? We have the ability to make things easier, but there's lots of other things that go into making this work. Things like how well your product is displayed, your product descriptions, your delivery times, your stock range. All of those things, to me, are more important than payments, but we should never underestimate what payments can do to a consumer journey if it's not managed correctly. So what we saw during this period of the quickening is retailers responding, and unfortunately some retailers not being able to adapt to the change. And generally, what we saw was what we tend to call it a kind of a unified approach to the way that you manage retail, is that retailers who already had a unified approach and had started to build their technical infrastructure to support that were able to pivot very quickly. And there's a few that we're going to talk to you about today. So one of the things that has been very, very prevalent that we see an awful lot of is the rise of platforms. And what we see is, and a lot of you will use these today, so we see platforms that give greater access to customers through frictionless purchases. So if we look at things like what happened in the hospitality sector very quickly moved to app-based purchase. So what you see is apps like Round that allows a consumer to go to a myriad of pubs up and down of the country or restaurants and use an app to pay, order a table. That, by the very nature of some of the restraints that we saw during COVID, caused that market to accelerate. We see some interesting apps that you may have heard of called AirPay and Ride, who tried to tackle a problem of what happens when we go to a contactless environment and a cashless society where people want to get in a private hire vehicle, but you don't have cash, and those private hire fleets don't want to purchase hardware and terminals. So what they do is they introduce marketplaces that allow lots of private hire fleets to adopt their technology, and when you get into a cab, it recognizes you're in the cab. Because you've already pre-booked a ride, it recognizes where you want to go, it pre-authorizes a card, and it determines where you stop. And you just step out of the cab when you've arrived. And it tries to tackle it, to some degree, that little bit of a gap between where Uber can touch and Uber can't. Stored cards, we see a lot of stored card type activity happening during COVID because it just helps not just the speed of checkout, but also as retailers try to upsell inside of an e-commerce environment, they have the ability to do in a much more seamless way. And then one of the big things that we've seen is the rise of large platforms like BigCommerce that give a very, very quick route to market for small retailers who can't build their own technology stack. So platforms, we have seen a significant growth in this space as a response to COVID. A brand everyone will probably recognize. What's really interesting for us, for Boohoo, is their whole capability to pivot in lots of different respects. You probably read the news that during COVID, it took 8 weeks to change their entire range, and all of a sudden all they sold was loungewear, because that's all everyone was doing. Pubs were closed, teenagers no longer could go out. They just switched the whole range within 8 weeks. What was also interesting is that they extended their portfolio. So we saw a lot of high street closures. So we see the closure of Debenhams, Oasis, Warehouse, where large bricks and mortar footprints no longer work, but actually really strong brands. And what if you're not aware, some of you may be aware, you may have seen lots of new Debenhams adverts on TV, which are really punchy ads, not what we're kind of used to with Debenhams. And I don't know how many of you were, but actually Boohoo purchased the right to Debenhams. And they did so because they wanted to be able to launch a beauty arm to their product division. And in doing so, they launched a Debenhams marketplace, which allows them not only to bring all of their brands in under one roof, but it also allows them to plug a gap in products that they're never going to sell themselves directly and to sell third-party product. Again, same principle as the slide before. It's a platform inviting a different way to sell online. Joe and the Juice, you probably all used it, right? Joe and the Juice already had an app before COVID. And what they did very, very quickly was pivot, and they used their app to allow people to order and pay ahead. And it gave them consistency throughout the pandemic where people could still go and purchase what they want and earn loyalty points. And I don't know how many of you use what they call their app pickup wall, where you could just order ahead and go and collect your drink. Fortnum & Mason. I was racking my brains. I saw the slide there. I was like, I can't remember what Fortnum & Mason did. What Fortnum & Mason did, which is really interesting, is they took the whole concept of luxury and said, how do we transfer the luxury experience that we offer customers in our store into the e-commerce environment? So I don't know how many of you know this. If you know, shove your hand in the air when I tell you. They introduced tea blending classes. Did anyone know that? So you can actually now go online and you can actually blend your own tea online, and you can brand it with your own name and have it delivered directly to your home. And that's what they used to do in the stores, and they realized that actually they couldn't do that any longer, but they wanted to continue with that experience, so they moved the whole thing online. It's an interesting point, actually, that what we tend to see, we have a luxury, I guess, when we work in the payment space as a vendor, we see retail is quite an incestuous industry, right? So people move between industries, and it's quite interesting when you see people move between industries to see what they bring. And Fortnum & Mason's CTO is the same CTO from the Burberry Group. So they move and they take quite interesting digital ideas and they kind of bring them across into different sectors. JD Sports, a big high street brand that you may have seen the press announcement as the UK was determining how they would come out of lockdown that said, at this point, JD stores didn't know whether or not they needed to reopen their stores. That's a massive statement for such a big footprint retailer. And the reason they were able to make that statement is because JD are a very, very forward-thinking business. And actually, the vast majority of the technology advancement that JD make is driven by e-commerce. It's not driven by retail. So the digital team drive the innovation throughout the footprint of retail stores. And very early, they'd already connected inventory. So as retail stores shut and the stock is spread across hundreds of retail stores, they just utilize them as fulfillment centers. And they continue to do that throughout the pandemic. If you compare that to some of their competitors like Foot Asylum, they have a different approach. They couldn't do that. They hadn't connected. So the only solution was to take all of that stock, pack it up and send it back to a distribution center, which is incredibly costly, whereas JD were allowed to pivot in that. And for any of you who go to a JD store, one of the things that you'll see is just the digital theater that they create. So they sell corners of their store to brands like Nike, and then they just implement digital walls. So what's next? Three things really, I think, that's important for us. And they're kind of in the wrong order. So one of the things that I think we all start to see and feel is that a customer's affinity and loyalty to a brand increasingly moves beyond product. Customers who are loyal to brand expect certain behaviors of those brands. And more what we see is an expectation that the brand ethics is aligned to the expectations of the customer. And what we start to see is how retailers use technology, so things like how do they contribute to charities? How do they demonstrate the value that they add in their supply chain? Because that is becoming more and more important as part of a considered choice. And it has to be, because if you take a JD Sport, for example, they sell the same trainers as all of the other retailers, right? So they've got to do something different, and part of that has to be about their brand ethic. So we see that becoming more and more important in the retail space. Artificial intelligence is a really interesting one for us, and here's where I do think about payments a little bit more. Artificial intelligence definitely has a place in the payment space. There's lots of areas where it works really well, but ultimately what really matters in payments, no matter what any payment expert, as they're called, will tell you, the most important thing about payments is to just give convenience. It has to be about convenience, because you don't shop on a website in a retail store to try and determine how good the payment experience was. You don't care generally, you just care that it's quick and it has to be easy. And artificial intelligence has a place to understand how you purchase. So things like giving you the right payment methods, presenting them at the right point in a page. And that kind of technology can make a difference. The other thing where artificial intelligence is really important is allowing retailers to combat fraud. Because as retail traffic moves online, we see changes in things like secure customer authentication as part of PSD2 starting to take a role in the wider environment, but helping every single one of us as individuals to transition through a checkout. That's where artificial intelligence can play a part. And then the last piece, we call it movement away from retail centres, but I kind of think of it as the acceleration of retail theatre. So one of the things that kind of happens throughout the pandemic is retailers have to get better at certain elements of their product life cycle, and that includes things like being smarter and quicker and faster on product delivery, giving customers more choice with delivery, thinking about depth of brand, etc. What that drives is less of a necessity for retail stores to stock all of the product. And what you start to see is a movement away from heavily stocked retail stores to stores as theatres, where you go and engage with the product. You don't necessarily go to take a product away, and those are starting to take more and more of a space in the retail space, because what we see is they can be fulfilled very well through an e-commerce offering. And actually that boundary begins to blur. And that's it. Thank you.